Right, hi guys, welcome to episode number 3, the difference between osteopathy and chiropractic. I can really speak as a chiropractor, obviously, because that's what I study, that's what I've done for 20 years, but I do know a little bit about osteopathy, having used it myself as a patient in the past. And obviously osteopathy and chiropractic, they're two manual therapies. They're ultimately very similar. And, osteopaths will tend to know a little bit about chiropractors and vice versa. So here goes. Basically, the first chiropractor was a guy called D.D. Palmer, Daniel David Palmer, and he invented chiropractic or founded chiropractic in 1895. But he was actually an osteopathy student. Osteopathy was founded 50 years earlier in 1845, and I guess he was in his osteopathy lessons and he kind of just thought of a slightly different way to do things. So I'll get onto that in a second. Basically, the focus of an osteopath is based upon, at the time anyway, the traditional theory, I'm not too sure about current, but the traditional theory was termed the law of the artery, because osteopaths believe that if there's good blood flow, good blood supply to an actual, damaged body part, I guess in this context, then it'll heal better, which is true, that makes sense. And subsequently, if you go to an osteopath for maybe, a little bit of lower back pain, what they will do is they will tend to use what they call a low velocity, high amplitude technique to try and mobilize, that's the key word, to try and mobilize the spine. And they call that manipulation. That was the original osteopathic term, was manipulation. So that's a low velocity, high amplitude thrust in order to mobilize the spine. Whereas a chiropractor will do kind of the opposite. They will use a high velocity, low amplitude, which means the hands move really fast, but they only move a little bit. So it's a high velocity, low amplitude thrust. And D.D. Palmer decided that he was going to adopt this slight variation to the original technique on the basis that he believed that the nervous system was actually the most important mechanism in terms of the body functioning well, healing, etc., etc. So, yeah, osteopathy, 1845. Chiropractic 50 years later, 1895. I do like to joke with my osteopath friends that chiropractic is basically the progression. So anyway, how does this high velocity, low amplitude thrust actually work? What does it do? So it's a misconception, common misconception, and I had it myself before my training. I just thought chiropractors just kind of popped things back into place. Now, obviously that's kind of true if you're talking about just a very short-term injury where maybe the back, maybe you bend over, sneeze, and the back kind of twists out. Yeah, at that point, we will just kind of put it back to where it should be. There's more to it than that, but that's just real simple terms. But your average patient who is a chronic pain patient who's been suffering for at least 3 months, because that's what chronic means, it's 3 months or longer, they're going to have a whole heap of other mechanisms going on. They're going to have obviously the misalignment, the change in muscle tone, the change in ligamentous tone, ligaments hold the bones together, and the brain being the kind of organ that monitors everything, that's going to have more or less picked up on all these adaptations to the original problem, and it's going to have created a whole heap of neural pathways between the problem and itself, the brain. So D.D. Palmer, I guess whether he knew it or not at the time, he was applying a high velocity, low amplitude thrust, which actually sets off a whole cascade of neurological events between the joints, the muscles, and the brain. So, to get a little bit more complicated, because at the end of the day you can rewatch this if you need to, there is a concept of proprioception, and that's a real key word in chiropractic. Proprioception is the brain's perception of where your body is in space. So the main mechanism in terms of balance and where your body is in space and coordination, things like that, is that the eyes must remain level with the horizon, because otherwise, obviously the ear canals are going to be swooshing all over the place and you're just going to feel unbalanced. So what that means is that if you end up, let's say again in simple terms, with maybe a twisted pelvis, As long as those eyes remain level with the horizon, your brain will just adapt to that, and it will just become the norm, and back pain will just become the norm. So when the chiropractor comes along and manipulates your sacroiliac joint, shall we say, in manipulating that joint, there's a rapid stretch of all the ligamentous tissue, and the ligaments house the receptors called proprioceptors, which are a group of mechanoreceptors. The proprioceptors essentially shout up to the brain that the joint has changed position, and the brain will then send a message down to that area, to the muscles, to change their tone according to the adjustment that has just taken place. Now, obviously that's a fresh impulse from the brain. It hasn't become established, it's just been an instantaneous thing. So the adjustment needs to be repeated time and time again in the short to medium term in order to essentially let the neurological system adapt to a new pathway and form a new pathway. So to simplify that all up, the chiropractor does the adjustment, the receptors and the ligaments shout up to the brain, the joint has changed position, the brain receives that proprioceptive input and it sends a message down to the muscular system to change its tone accordingly. And then over time, obviously we regain function. Obviously there is going to be an increase in blood flow if everything's functioning better. So I don't think one can separate chiropractic and osteopathy completely, but whereas mobilization is aimed to, reduce muscle tone, reduce muscle spasm, mobilize joints, improve blood flow. Obviously the high velocity adjustment is aimed at creating a neurological reaction to try and get into the restoration of function on that deep neurological level. So hopefully that wasn't too much kind of science, but that's essentially how chiropractic works, and that's probably the main difference between a chiropractor and an osteopath. It all just boils down to technique. If you've watched my first video, I mentioned a guy called Mark Cashley, the guy that inspired me, and incidentally he went on to be the president of the Scottish Chiropractic Association at one point. But he always used to say, a good osteopath is better than a bad chiropractor. So essentially what that means is we are both manual therapists, and it basically boils down to finding someone who really knows what they're doing. Luckily I believe I do. So yeah, that's probably the main difference. The only other sort of practical difference is that chiropractors tend to be trained in radiology and how to read x-rays, how to take x-rays. Osteopaths don't. We're both trained to prescribe exercises, so there's some commonalities, there's some differences, and yeah, I don't really think I can explain that anymore. So yeah, if you have any other questions, just leave them in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe, as I always briefly say at the end, because that will help you keep up with current content. Right, so that's the end of episode 3. I haven't decided what I'm doing for episode 4 yet, but hope you enjoyed this. All right, thanks guys.